It was crazy until they were right all along. Hemingway, before he took his life, he became extremely paranoid the FBI was following him. His wife and the people around him just thought he was mentally ill and grew deeply concerned. Hemingway went as far as getting electrotherapy at a psychiatric hospital to try and help with the perceived delusions. Turns out the FBI had been following and bugging him for years, according to declassified files. In the days of landlines, my phone was tapped. I could hear a strange hollow sound, and I knew someone was listening. I had had a bad accident and was home for almost a year and involved in a lawsuit. I told my attorney about it. He told me the insurance company wouldn't bother. I mentioned it to my roommate. She told me I was crazy. I began to notice a van parked on my street. It was there for several days. I thought I was under surveillance. My attorney and my roommate said I was crazy. A person came to my door asking questions about the neighborhood. They claimed to be from a real estate company. They didn't go to other houses. I thought I was being watched. My attorney and my roommate said I was crazy. Several weeks later, my roommate's boyfriend was arrested for stealing physical and intellectual property from IBM. It was the beginning of the tech era, and he stole millions in hardware and software and ideas. We were being watched to see if we were involved. The phone was tapped. We were under surveillance. We were taped. I wasn't crazy after all. Ludwig Boltzmann. His equations and formulas explained the physical properties of matter, but as they went against the then accepted laws of physics, he was ridiculed and ignored for years, while fighting for atom theory to be accepted. He took his own life just 3 years before Ernest Rutherford discovered the nucleus of an atom, proving Boltzmann's theory. For a very long time, the medical community thought that stomach ulcers were caused by stress. A doctor in Australia called Barry Marshall claimed they were wrong, and that they were caused by an excess of certain bacteria, and the cure was simple antibiotics. The medical community ridiculed him and nearly ended his career. He eventually decided the only way to prove he was right was to infect himself, develop the ulcers, and cure himself. In curing himself, he was proved right and won the Nobel Prize for his efforts, and now stomach ulcers are very easily treatable. They previously affected 1 in 10 people. Sinead O'Connor. Younger Redditors might not know who she is, but she was a singer-songwriter from Ireland, who was a staple in the alternative music scene during the late 80s and early to mid-90s, who had some crossover hits. Anyway, at the height of her popularity, she was the musical guest on Saturday Night Live, after cancelling an earlier scheduled spot in protest against the guest host, which was some dumbest stand-up comic from the 80s, called Andrew Dice Clay. During her performance, she sang an a cappella version of Bob Marley's War, changing the lyrics to make it about child abuse instead of racism. At the end of the performance, she shouted something like, "Fight the real enemy," and ripped up a picture of the Pope. In the following weeks, people lost their shit, and on the next episode of Saturday Night Live, they had at least 3 sketches that tore her apart. J. Harlan Bretz. He was a geologist that in the 1920s came up with a theory about why the dry falls and surrounding scablands of eastern Washington state were so sharp and abrupt, instead of smooth as should be with the general understanding of erosion. Especially since the falls have no real river to speak of to create erosion. His theory was that a giant flood, created by an even more massive lake, ripped through the region millions of years ago, reshaping the landscape in a matter of days. He was laughed at and discredited in the geology community for almost 50 years. Until someone discovered evidence in the 1950s of an ancient and massive lake that started just north of Montana, that stretched all the way to southern Utah. The lake was believed to have been created by glacial dams, ice walls, during the last ice age. It would fill up over thousands of years, and then hit a point where a glacial dam broke, and the lake water would fire out the break like a water cannon, drain the lake, and reshape an entire region over several days as the water flowed toward the ocean. This happened several times. Since the flood that carved the dry falls likely started from the Lake Missoula area in modern-day Montana, it was named the Great Missoula Flood. Bretz was given an award in 1979 for his contribution to geology when he was 96 years old. He joked, "All my enemies are dead, so I have no one to gloat over." Harry Markopolos spent 10 years trying to convince everyone, investors, journalists, regulatory agencies, etc., that Bernie Madoff was a fraud, based on forensic accounting. Madoff was one of the most respected names on Wall Street, and despite the overwhelming evidence, no one was willing to entertain the thought he might be running a Ponzi scheme. Harry's book, No One Would Listen, is a pretty great account of financial detective work, and just the abject frustration of being absolutely certain you're right, but no one believes you. Michael Burry, the first guy to predict the 2008 housing market crash. He was a hedge fund manager for Cyan Capital at the time, and basically bet his entire fund's liquidity, all the money the fund had, that there would be a crash. No one believed him except a few other people who also bet against the market. Several of his clients sued him for tying their money up in what they considered to be a foolish bet, all to have him be right in the end. He made his fund something like $1.3 billion, and the value increased by about 489%. The movie The Big Short is about him and the few other people who were wise enough to bet against the market at the time. I've watched the movie like 5 times in order to try to understand exactly what happened, but still don't fully get it. I recommend it to anyone who's interested. Fun fact: Michael Burry was also ahead of the curve in the recent GameStop surge. I think he had something like 1.2 million shares of GameStop months before the price shot up. Might need to fact check myself. When the Civil War broke out, everyone on both sides thought it would be a quick victory. However, Sherman kept saying it would be a bloodbath that would drag on for years. His superiors decided he was insane and sent him out west to fight Indians, Native Americans, just to get rid of him. After it all came true, and they needed some better generals, they said, maybe we should bring back the Sherman guy. When I was in Boy Scout camp, we had this counselor named Don. He was kind of odd. He knew everything about trees and only really talked about trees. We had just gotten back from a hike that Don was on with us, and we were just sitting around talking, and he suddenly goes, "You know, they're gonna let girls into Boy Scout soon." We were all like, "Yeah, okay Don." But sure enough, less than 3 years later, they did it. My wife never liked my mom's husband. He apparently made a pass at her before we were married, and I just wrote it off as Bob being Bob, because it was honestly semi-innocent, and at the time, he and my mom were newlyweds. But over the years we started finding out he was hitting my mother, he was constantly cheating on my mom, and he punched my mom in the head outside on the ice, causing her to hit her head on the pavement, fracturing her skull, and causing an almost fatal brain hemorrhage. She needed 2 brain surgeries, and now deals with balance issues, and almost complete loss of taste and smell, and hearing in one ear. He has never faced any consequences for anything because, for reasons I can't quite understand, local law enforcement in their podunk town takes his side every time she calls the cops on him. One time they even took her to jail because his drunk ass fell in the walk-in pantry while they were having an argument, and he called the cops and said she beat him up. He's literally twice her size. Some questions I've had to answer a few times. He has moved out and they are getting a divorce. I haven't kicked his ass because I live 1,000 miles away. I don't know where he lives, and I am the sole breadwinner for my wife and 2 daughters. If I go to jail, they become homeless. My mom doesn't want him in jail yet because he pays the bills, and if he stops working, she loses her much-needed health insurance and her home. The divorce trial is just around the corner, and my sister and my friend's sister have agreed to testify against him. So we're gonna see how that goes. The Radium Girls. When radium had just come to the US and was being marketed on dials for Warren watches, girls used their lips to fix the paintbrushes to make their numbers and dials perfect. Eventually, they started suffering horrible, painful experiences due to the radium. These girls fought for years to figure out A. what was wrong with them, B. who was responsible, and C. how they were going to pay their bills or support their families. It's a horrible injustice. These girls needed support and validation that they weren't crazy, that it was radium, and it took far too long and too many deaths for it to happen. Me? About my, now disowned, cousin. He kept stealing things from me which my family felt was no big deal. But it escalated. It went from stealing candy, to my things, to cash, and after that, I asked them how much longer they would support him, and call me selfish for not sharing. The line was finally crossed when he stole our grandmother's credit cards and her car. She finally wrote him off. This was after he had stolen all of her jewelry, including the last present, anniversary ring, my grandfather was ever to give her. Oh, but he tried to say that our family kicked him out because he's gay. No. None of us cared about that, it was because he was a thief. His friends have bailed him out of jail and then dropped him when he steals from them. But he claims the world is just unfair to him. Now he tells his pity story and milks that my family disowned me because I'm gay to everyone he begs from. I learned this when he tried to do it for one of my friends. Martha Mitchell, she was the wife of Nixon's ag, John Mitchell. She was outspoken in the extreme and was one of the first to talk openly about what really happened. Since she was also known to love her Martiness, she was widely written off as a drunk, crazy woman. Behind the scenes, a White House doctor began heavily sedating her, and her husband locked her away from the press. No one believed her until Nixon resigned and this story came out. To this day, most people only remember her as that loud-mouthed Martha Mitchell. In 1912, the meteorologist Alfred Wegener described what he called continental drift, an idea that culminated 50 years later in the modern theory of plate tectonics. Wegener expanded his theory in his 1915 book The Origin of Continents and Oceans. Starting from the idea, also expressed by his forerunners, that the present continents once formed a single land mass, later called Pangaea, Wegener suggested that these separated and drifted apart, likening them to icebergs of low-density granite, floating on a sea of denser basalt. Supporting evidence for the idea came from the dove-tailing outlines of South America's east coast and Africa's west coast, and from the matching of the rock formations along these edges. Confirmation of their previous contiguous nature also came from the fossil plants Glossopteris and Gangomopteris, and the therapsids mammal-like reptile Listersaurus, all widely distributed over South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia. The evidence for such an erstwhile joining of these continents was patent to field geologists working in the southern hemisphere. The South African Alex du Toit put together a mass of such information in his 1937 publication Our Wandering Continents, and went further than Wegener in recognizing the strong links between the Gondwana fragments. Wegener's work was initially not widely accepted, in part due to a lack of detailed evidence. The Earth might have a solid crust and mantle and a liquid core, but there seemed to be no way that portions of the crust could move around. Distinguished scientists, such as Harold Jeffreys and Charles Schuchard, were outspoken critics of continental drift. In the 2012 presidential debates between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, both were asked what the greatest foreign threats to America were. Mitt Romney said Russia, and became the butt of jokes on both sides of the aisle for it. Didn't you know the Cold War was over anyway? There's plenty about the guy I don't like, but I think about that answer a surprising amount as politics unfurls now. I almost feel like I'd have to apologize if I ever met him for how stupid I and everyone else found that at the time. Barbara McClintock. After being accepted into the scientific community as a woman in the 40s, which was quite a feat, she was invited to the National Academy of Sciences, which was a huge deal. After that, she discovered transposons, pieces of DNA that move around your genome, very simplified. Everyone thought she was crazy and she was ostracized from the scientific community. Despite having mountains of evidence and continued research, people just didn't believe her. Talking about a reaction at the time. I was startled when I found they didn't understand it, didn't take it seriously. It didn't bother me, I just knew I was right. Anybody who had had that evidence thrown at them with such abandon couldn't help but come to the conclusions I did about it. She essentially said they were all fake and returned to her cornfields until around the 70s when it became possible. They marked genes and found that they do indeed travel around the genome. She then got her Nobel Prize and was like, alright, back to work. She said at the time, you just know sooner or later, it will come out in the wash, but you may have to wait some time. She died sometime in the 90s, saying of her experience, I just have been so interested in what I was doing and it's been such a pleasure, such a deep pleasure, that I never thought of stopping. I've had a very, very satisfying and interesting life. She never got too upset, she just kept her head down, and kept doing her work because she knew it was right, and she knew it was important. This doesn't even begin to talk about all the discrimination she faced, but suffice it to say that she had a powerful impact on genetics, and she's now one of my role models in my own research.